Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part two of our series of lessons on the causes of the Civil War and the answer to the question, how did the United States careen towards civil war? It's the same essential question as part one, so we don't need to write the essential question again. So let's jump right into the learning, folks. Our first left side question today is, what was Bleeding Kansas? Bleeding Kansas is the title given to a series of events that describe what took place in Kansas Territory and how that caused tension between the North and South over the issue of slavery. In 1854, the Missouri Compromise, also known as the Compromise of 1820, was repealed, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. So all of the provisions in the Compromise of 1820 that you learned in part one of this lesson were removed, and they replaced those provisions with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What that did was a result of the ideas of Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. Stephen A. Douglas was a senator from Illinois. He was a Democrat. He's famous for having debated Abraham Lincoln in Illinois to win his Senate seat. And as a result of that, he also went on to debate Abraham Lincoln for the presidency and lost. So Stephen A. Douglas is a rather famous fellow. He's a Northern Democrat. Basically, this allowed Kansas and Nebraska territories, they were not yet states, to vote for whether or not they wanted to have slaves in their territory. Very similar to Utah and New Mexico territory under the Compromise of 1850, this extended the idea of popular sovereignty to Kansas and Nebraska. So even though Kansas and Nebraska were actually north of the Mason-Dixon line, they were going to allow them to vote for whether or not they did or did not want slaves. And therein lies the rub. Because Kansas and Nebraska were north of the Mason-Dixon line, the North saw this as a giveaway to the South, because from the North's perspective, those territories should have automatically been slave-free. As a result of this legal decision, people moved to Kansas and Nebraska in droves, both people who wanted to have slavery and people who didn't want to have slavery. There was no law enforcement present. This is the wild frontier. And so often, pro-slave and anti-slave forces would clash violently with each other in a rather lawless environment, and lives were lost, blood was spilled, thus the term Bleeding Kansas. In the U.S., we just kind of let the frontier open up and sent people out there. Our neighbors to the north in Canada had a different perspective on that. They sent the Royal Canadian Mounted Police out into the frontier first, established law and order before people moved in, and so things were a little more orderly there. But this was ugly. And this was something that basically upset the North, because the North felt that Kansas and Nebraska should be slave-free because they were north of the Mason-Dixon line. And basically, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Mason-Dixon line. As a result, one of the bricks that in the groundwork for the Civil War had been laid. This kind of peeled off some scabs and exposed just how raw people's emotions were over slavery. Our next topic is the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And this is a Supreme Court decision having to do with a slave by the name of Dred Scott. And it's a very famous decision. It's also considered one of the worst decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. Let's discuss. Dred Scott was a slave born in Virginia. And of course, Virginia was a southern state, and therefore it was a slave state. Over time, his owner moved around a lot, and in many cases, his owner moved to non-slave states. So his owner moved to Illinois, his owner moved to Wisconsin. Those states did not allow slavery. So this opened up a number of rather important legal questions. His owner eventually died, and when his owner died, Dred Scott actually sued with the help of some abolitionist lawyers for his freedom, claiming that because he had lived in free states, he should therefore be free. So if you're living in a state that doesn't allow slavery and you're a slave, should you still be a slave? That was the question, and the Supreme Court of the United States considered that question. As I said before, he was helped by important abolitionist lawyers. Remember from your vocabulary list that an abolitionist is someone who favored the ending of slavery. The Supreme Court did eventually rule on this case, and in 1857, it ruled that slaves were not considered citizens, and therefore they were not protected by the Constitution. Let me repeat that. They said slaves were not citizens and were therefore not protected by the Constitution. So the Supreme Court of the United States essentially said slaves were not human and were therefore not deserving of rights. That ruling was written by this gentleman, Chief Justice Taney of Maryland, and this is considered widely to be one of the most embarrassing Supreme Court decisions in history for reasons that I hope would be obvious. And obviously, if you're a Northerner, if you're an abolitionist, this is not a decision that makes you happy. And this was another thing that peeled off some more scabs that convinced the North that things were just not right and things were just not going their way. But then there were also some things that upset the South. And that would be Brown's Raid. Brown's Raid was an event that really upset the South. John Brown was a radical abolitionist from the North. And those pictures there really kind of tell the tale. When we use the word radical, if you look at him, he looks kind of radical, and that was his rep. So we're going to go with that. He decided he wanted to go down to Virginia and start a slave rebellion in Harper's Ferry. And his plan for doing that involved raiding a weapons depot in Harper's Ferry, busting out a bunch of guns, getting those guns to the slaves, and basically hoping the slaves would rise up and take out their masters and start something big. That was his idea. It was a rather radical idea. Want to guess how it turned out? The raid lasted for 3 days, and it was eventually put down by a gentleman by the name of Robert E. Lee. You're going to want to remember that name, Robert E. Lee, because Robert E. Lee started off as a U.S. general, cut his teeth in the Mexican-American War, was known for his tactical brilliance, and in this case, he was assigned to put down this rebellion at the weapons depot in Harper's Ferry. He was a Virginian, and later on, during the Civil War, he would be a very important general for the South. Brown was captured. A rather showy trial took place that was followed by everyone in the North and the South. It was kind of like the O.J. Simpson trial of its day. And I realize when you hear that, the O.J. Simpson trial occurred like 10 years before you were born. But when the O.J. Simpson trial was on, it was on TV every single day, and people were obsessed with it. Brown used it as a platform for his abolitionist ideas and to rail against slavery, and the Southerners wanted to make sure that he was made an example of, so he was put to death rather publicly. And the Southerners wanted that to send a message to Northerners who wanted to come down and mess with their business and mess with their slaves. So the result of all three of these things I'm telling you about is both Northern feelings and Southern feelings were very, very raw, and it was getting more and more difficult to maintain this fiction that North and South were unified as part of the same country. It was becoming very clear that was not the case. And the South was quite frankly terrified that Northerners would take it upon themselves to come down south and mess with their system. So there started to be a clamoring for secession, for having the Southern states actually leave the United States of America, form their own country, and not deal with this anymore. And then there was an election, ladies and gentlemen. The election of 1860, one of the most unique and one of the most consequential elections in the history of our country. In the election of 1860, there were actually 4 candidates for president, but not all of them appeared on the ballot in all of the states. Wrap your head around that, kids. Feelings over slavery did reach a fever pitch, and then the election of 1860 happened. And the election of 1860 was clearly going to have a lot of consequences for how the issue of slavery was going to be dealt with. It was a 4-way race between Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, who I mentioned earlier, John Breckinridge, and John Bell. The problem is that in the North, Lincoln and Douglas appeared on the ballot, and in the South, Breckinridge and Bell appeared on the ballot. So, the North had more electoral votes, so whoever won in the North was very likely going to win over whoever won in the South. This is the first time a Northerner actually won the presidency in quite some time. One of the reasons the Civil War had been avoided is because the South continued to elect presidents of their own region, and so they felt comfortable with that. But in this particular case, that was not the case. This is also the first time that Oregon ever voted in a presidential election because we became a state in 1859. Because the vote was split between 4 candidates, Abraham Lincoln did become the first Republican ever elected president. So the first time the Republicans ever ran a presidential candidate was in 1856. It was John C. Fremont. He lost to James Buchanan, but Abraham Lincoln successfully defeated all 3 of his opponents, even though he didn't appear on the ballot in any southern state. And as a result, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. His philosophy was that slavery should be prohibited in the territories and contained to the states where it already existed. The South was not down with that. In fact, they were so not down on that the southern states decided before Lincoln ever became president to leave the United States of America. So between November of 1860 and March 4th of 1861, my birthday, when Lincoln became president, many of the southern states seceded, left the United States of America, and formed their own country, the Confederate States of America, and the groundwork for the Civil War had been completely laid. This is a county-by-county map of the election of 1860. Everyone always asks me, what about the white states? Well, that's because there were no states there yet. They didn't vote because they were not states yet. And South Carolina, as you will notice, had actually already left the Union and did not participate in the election of 1860. Therefore, you do not see any election results or electoral vote totals from South Carolina. It's just a little gray spot there. So on this map, Lincoln is in red, Douglas is in blue, Breckinridge is in green, and Bell is in yellow and orange. So you can literally see the Mason-Dixon line pretty much right across here. And you'll notice all the orange and green down here, and you'll notice all the red and blue up here. The only place you really see a mixture is in Missouri and in some of the border state areas. And of course, South Carolina here did not participate at all. If you want to look at our lovely state of Oregon, of course, the counties are now different in Oregon than they were back then. Marion County did vote for Lincoln. It looks like Lynn County to our south voted for Breckinridge. So Oregon was kind of all over the place, and so was California. But the whole north-south divide over here was very much in evidence. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it is the time that always happens at the end of one of Mr. Blumendahl's lessons. It is time to write your summary. Your summary should answer 2 questions, and if it does, you're going to have a good summary. The first question is, what 3 events pushed tensions over the line? And since I just told you about 3 events, you should know what they are. And what happened in the election of 1860? And what made it important? If you can answer those questions, you're going to have a delicious summary, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, this is once again Mr. Blumendahl signing off again on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies